Morena e te whānau. It's fantastic to have the New Zealand infrastructure community or family here together over the last couple of days and in person. Thanks again, as Sarah mentioned, a great night of festivities last night, so thank you for making it here today. Thank you also, especially to those joining us online. It would have been a very different 2020 for all of us if Crown Infrastructure Partners hadn't been so successful at rolling out UFB across New Zealand. We heard yesterday about the challenges of funding our future, and on this panel we'll discuss funding and financing challenges for social infrastructure, in particular schools, hospitals and public housing. As we've heard from the other speakers in the session this morning, like other infrastructure assets, our social infrastructure requires a significant amount of funding to rectify a historic underinvestment in this sector. On the other hand, there is an enormous amount of funds under management or financing around the globe that is looking for long-term investments, offering secure returns in politically stable countries like New Zealand. Social infrastructure assets are intergenerational assets and require intergenerational financing. And with low interest rates and a limitation on how much more the government can borrow relative to GDP, we need to utilise more financing tools and learn from existing tools that work very well in New Zealand, such as LGFA's financing program for local authorities, Kāinga Ora's wellbeing borrowing program, and dare I say it, public-private partnerships that are delivering social outcomes at a lower cost than the public sector comparators. So I'll start the panel off with a couple of questions, but please do send yours through on the app, and we can see how we go today. Peter, I might kick off with you from your experience from your many transactions across the ditch. In the assessment of funding of projects, do we fully consider the social objectives, of the social outcomes, of social infrastructure?
The answer to that would be no. And I think one of the critical challenges when you're talking about funding social infrastructure is to understand what social outcome you want to achieve. I think that's one of the key problems. And if I think about some examples, which I'm happy to explore, that a lot of the times we don't really think through the social outcomes we want to achieve from the social infrastructure. We do with economic infrastructure, and I think that's the distinction I want to make. You know, with economic infrastructure, you know, I just remember going into Transport for New South Wales and someone proudly had a photo up of the M7 motorway before and after. And they clearly understood what they wanted to achieve from that piece of infrastructure. But with social infrastructure, a lot of the times the outcomes are not, that are achieved are not necessarily what was intended at the beginning.
And does then good social infrastructure incentivise intended social outcomes?
Some of the times the outcomes you get from social infrastructure are not what was written in the business case. And I think of a couple of examples, and I apologise, I've only been in New Zealand this year, so my examples will be across the ditch. But for example, the Alexander McConaughey Centre, which is Canberra's prison. So if you look at the outcomes that project achieved, they weren't ones that were written into the business case. So to give you an idea of what this prison looks like, you walk into the low security section and you go in there and there's a flat screen TV, there's a lounge, there's a kitchen where the prisoners cook their own meals. Each prisoner has their own room. So you've got a really human rights compliant prison. But what outcome did you get out of that prison? Well, what you got was an increase in the incarceration rates, because no longer were the judiciary sending prisoners to Goulburn, to a prison that was called the Killing Fields. They're sending them to a human rights compliant prison. As a result, we got outcomes that weren't intended originally when the social infrastructure was contemplated and delivered. The same thing I can say about another social infrastructure asset, which was Frankly Early Childhood School. Probably traumatising people in Canberra and infrastructure right now. But that was an incredibly expensive and extremely attractive school. It had a sculptural courtyard. Each classroom had its own kitchenette. And as a result, what we got was, again, another outcome that wasn't intended, is that people migrating from New South Wales to the Australian Capital Territory just to send their children to this school. So the point being is that often, some of the times we get, not sometimes, quite often, when we build really high quality social infrastructure, we don't necessarily understand the outcomes we're driving. But the point being is that in those circumstances, you can use social infrastructure to drive social outcomes if you contemplate them up at the time of creating your business case.
Yeah, prison is a very interesting example because I think Karen, to Auckland South Correctional Facility, or Wiri Prison as it may more commonly be known, that was a very ambitious first PPP for New Zealand that really had social outcomes at the core of the procurement. Is that transactional example that other agencies can learn from?
Well, I certainly think it's an example of, pushing the boat out on outcomes. It was not when we went to market, there was not a high degree of prescription. And I think back now, it's some years ago, that the department at the time was looking for a catalyst for change. It had been stuck in a particular model of prison services, and it was looking to the private sector to bring new ideas, innovation. And, some of the proposals were quite scary in a sense. So the department took very bold move. And at that time, if you think about the discussion today, people are talking about broader outcomes, they're talking about well-being, they're talking about reducing reoffending, they're talking about whole-of-life asset management, they're talking about a whole range of things. No one was talking about that 10 years ago or so when we embarked on that project. So it was hugely innovative. It was, it was a very big move for the department at that time. And but the department itself has changed since then. It has moved on a whole range of outcomes-focused initiatives, new policies and procedures. So, it was an interesting discussion at that time in 2010 to 12 because we anticipated that as the department learnt and as it learnt from the innovation it was seeing, that it would change and then the private sector would change and there'd be this constant sort of growth in new models and new ideas in relation to prison services. And I think that has been a challenge, keeping that up actually.
Thank you. And Hugh, more broadly across the rest of the PPP and social housing reform programs, what do you think the government's learned from its engagement with private financing?
So I think consistent with what Karen said, the PPP program in particular was started off with a real focus on innovation and improving outcomes rather than being a balance sheet tool in New Zealand. I mean, the stated aim of Treasury when the model was adopted over here was to sort of stand on the shoulders of giants, which was the offshore PPP markets that we followed on from, but with quite a different mindset behind it. But I think leaving the contract model to one side, it was the procuring for outcomes that I think the government learnt a lot from, and the overall lift to the standard of procurement within the public sector. I think having the private sector rigour within the procurement process has really lifted the sort of evaluation criteria and the models that we had to put in place to actually rigorously select against the incredibly complex bids that we had to consider. I think other points to bear in mind really are the risk allocation. It is much more rigorous when you've got private sector involvement. I'll talk about this a bit more later on hopefully, but I think there's quite an interesting tension between the PPP type model and the construction sector accord and the way that the markets have moved over the last decade. I think the last point I'll make really is the Crown's learnt a lot about dealing with SPVs. I mean, SPVs are not a solution in themselves. They're sometimes sort of touted as a solution. SPVs are neither good nor evil. They can be either. But inherently, the Crown learnt a lot about what the role of the SPV was. I think we may have been slightly naive at the outset. We've had the spectrum between complete financing pass-through vehicles through to more capitalised and more heavily managed SPVs, and I think the Crown did go on a bit of a journey in terms of ensuring it asked for what it needed in terms of that SPV role.
Thanks. And Ngahuia, we've heard from Crown Infrastructure Partners at previous INZ events about the establishment of the IFF legislation. Just as a refresher, what's CIP's role in IFF and what lessons can we learn from previous policy interventions to position it for success?
Kia ora everybody. Yes, so CIP will be playing the role of the facilitator and we will be bringing together what are a range of parties from very different sectors. We'll have the landowners, the developers, the council, the financier, the Treasury, the Ministry of Housing and Urban Development, plus all of the consulted departments. So there will be quite a few collaborative parties brought together, and we will guide them through the IFF process in the hope that we'll have a structured transaction at the end that is not only beneficial to everyone involved, but is something that Cabinet and Treasury and the Ministry of Housing and Urban Development all feel very comfortable recommending. It's been interesting listening over the past couple of days. It seems like people might be feeling a bit disappointed maybe with the political cycles, that they're so short, and it can sometimes hinder the progress we can make with policy. And I think one of the interesting learnings from IFF has been that actually it's been politically supported by both sides pretty much through the whole development of the policy work, and people might not realise that this work actually started under the national government and then was brought in and developed further under the Labour government, and actually that's been really beneficial for us, and having that long-term support from across both political parties has actually helped, I think, to set the model up for it to be more enduring and long-term. So that's been an interesting learning for me, I think.
That's great, thank you. And we've got a few questions coming through, but please do continue to send them through. One that's been asked, and I'll open this up to the whole panel. Wellbeing and outcomes are a clear focus in New Zealand in terms of social infrastructure procurement. But what evidence do we have, or how are agencies actually monitoring that we're delivering on any of those outcomes? Does anyone want to take that?
That's
Karen?
a really good question. I'm guessing we probably aren't. It's not that there aren't. I mean, clearly there are outcomes, social outcomes that arise from schools and building schools and hospitals and prisons. Otherwise, clearly we wouldn't do it. But whether we're explicitly prescribing them at the outset and then explicitly measuring them at some later point in time would only be by proxy. So, who, for example, really can say what the improved health outcomes will be from the acute services building that's just opened in Christchurch? So, because I don't have any idea of what that might be and how we might measure that, and whether in fact that project and the spend on that project and the size of it and the very bespoke nature of its design is actually contributing to a better outcome, or could we have spent some of that money elsewhere? And I know that's quite controversial, but that's the sort of debate that we really need to have.
And I think, at the risk of relabouring my previous point, I mean, you can sit on, I can sit on the Canberra Light Rail project and I can look at the buildings that are being demolished and redeveloped, and I can see with my eyes the outcomes that are being achieved with economic infrastructure. With social infrastructure, I say a project like, and I keep using Canberra project, the University of Canberra Public Hospital, we know that people are actually having their lives improved because they're rehabilitating from a car crash, etc. It's really difficult to have a measurement of that. You see it in the community, but it's very difficult just to grab a metric and say that's how we're measuring this.
Points. And Karen, maybe back to you again. How do agencies with limited funding decide between $1 for services or $1 for infrastructure? If infrastructure is never funded as services are the priority, is the strategy in effect run to fail?
Well, yes, probably. Social infrastructure asset management is clearly a run-to-fail strategy. I think, the discussion around the deficit in social infrastructure clearly demonstrates that quite starkly. It's a very tough call. If you have only $1 to spend, are you going to spend it on your asset or are you going to spend it on the patient coming through the door? I think we all know the answer. And the incentives, clearly are, to spend that dollar on the patient. In fact, one of the criticisms of the early private finance initiative PPP projects in the UK, which were largely hospitals, in fact, was that the money to be spent on the asset to maintain it, to ensure that it continued to deliver the level of service that was required, was locked up. And so the true cost of delivering the services was being revealed, but of course it was inadequate. So, that is the daily trade-off that boards that are running social assets essentially have to make every day, and it's a very tough call. So I'm not surprised that a National Asset Management Plan published for health suggests that our health infrastructure is in a dire state. And I worked in and did infrastructure projects for health projects that were Victorian, Edwardian, Georgian. Well, we're talking about facilities in New Zealand that were built, as I recall, the Dunedin Hospital building being built while I was at university in Dunedin. So it's not that long ago, and now we're back into, another, large billion-dollar spend within a generation.
We've got another question coming in from the floor for the panel. Are there any good tools outside of PPPs to ensure that our social infrastructure assets are adequately maintained to achieve whole-of-life outcomes? Go for it.
Well, there are other models. So certainly with one of the organisations that are a client of ours, there are other models which can bring the benefits of bundled procurement without necessarily having a finance solution. So it's called a few things, but there's your design, construct, maintain, operate models, which can bring in maintenance and operation. Design, construct, maintain. They can bring a lot of the benefits associated with PPPs without a finance solution, but the people who work in infrastructure finance, of course, wouldn't be highly enthusiastic about such models, but they do exist.
Can I just speak to that one briefly as well? I'd love to see a DBM or similar in practice. I mean, we've talked about it a lot in New Zealand in terms of getting skin in the game for the asset management solution, and have really been unable to find the model that keeps people in there with the long-term incentives without an equity slice in the deal. So I think, if we can develop a DBM model that can be rolled out at scale, that'd be a fantastic tool other than for the project financiers.
Thanks, Hugh. And on that, I'll follow on with that one then. You did mention before the value that private finance brings from a diligence perspective. In order for the government to attract private capital through a new or revised model for investment for social infrastructure, what should this look like?
I think there's a few elements to this. I mean, it was traditional at this conference to talk about PPP Light, which I won't do. That was put to bed about 5 years ago. One of the questions really, and because I'm not a public servant, I will speak freely, is whether really the PPP model should be dead in the social infrastructure sector. I mean, the issue is to fund and to finance social infrastructure, you need a revenue stream, which is self-evident. It doesn't generate its own revenue stream. And so the question is really whether you would be dressing up the same model in different clothing to create the same sort of model or outcome. So personally, I think that it was a real shame to remove the tool from education, health and other social sectors if you leave the services side out of it. I mean, if you've got an asset-focused project and a focus on AM/FM and whole-of-life costs being transferred to the private sector, that's not traditionally an ideological issue across the world, but it has been made one here, and it's a shame to have that currently ruled out, but I suspect it will sit there in the background and things will change over time. In terms of different models, I wish I did have the silver bullet. I think my sort of experience in New Zealand, and I suspect yours is similar, is that the bang for the buck of private investment in these deals has been limited because the pipeline has always been limited by sort of political changes. It's also had, I expect, a bid cost to pay off sort of analysis that wouldn't work over time without the scale of doing these things on a sort of replicated basis. So I think if we can develop something simpler that can be removed from the political side of the spectrum in terms of the pipeline, and to reduce bid costs and to make complete transparency of where the risk allocations sit, that's where we need to look for a model, but I don't have a silver bullet as to actually how you implement that.
Oh, sorry, we're not quite the power panel I think Sarah was looking for. But on that, sorry, Hugh. On that too, I don't think there are many school principals or boards of trustees out there that are saying they want to focus less on education and focus more on the maintenance of the building that they're looking after. Ngahuia, another one for you. Perhaps a tired question, but nevertheless one that comes up all the time. Why don't we just borrow more off the Crown's balance sheet?
As the millennial on the panel, I think it can be quite concerning to hear those comments. That can sometimes be said quite flippantly, I think. It's easy to say just borrow and we'll worry about it later, but the reality is somebody eventually does need to pay it back, and like Karen said, you're sacrificing $1 somewhere else to pay that back in the future, and it'll be a different set of people that are either receiving less services or paying a little bit more out of their pay each week, but someone will be paying it back. And I remember when I was an analyst at Treasury in my first 2 years, the Minister of Finance, Minister English, was very focused on getting net debt back to 20%, and we've just heard from the new Secretary to Treasury it's now at 50% of net debt, and the whole building was working on finding every dollar they could to try and reduce that debt. We were selling things, we were cutting services, and so eventually that will happen. Some sacrifice would need to be made by a different generation.
Peter, a more challenging one for you perhaps. Is it appropriate for the private sector to be earning a profit on social infrastructure?
Well, given they earn a loss quite often as well, I'd have to say that it is appropriate. I think in principle, particularly with public-private partnerships, what you want to see, almost in principle with every construction contract, you want to see the private sector earning a reasonable outcome, earning a reasonable profit that gives them a sustainable business model without earning a supernormal profit. And so, unfortunately, there's one project which is quite notorious in the United Kingdom called Gully Prison, where the private sector did earn supernormal profits. And that's something, as a government construction procurement person, I definitely always want to see outcomes where the private sector is earning a reasonable outcome from their projects. I think the point I made at the beginning is that I've been on plenty of PPPs, in particular, where the private sector has incurred a loss. So I have no issue whatsoever with them earning a profit. I want them to earn a profit, because if they don't earn a profit, it's not a sustainable business model for government to be in. So it is the healthiest outcome for government, from a government perspective, for the private sector to be earning a reasonable profit. The only time we get concerned, as I said, is where that profit is not a reasonable profit, but that doesn't happen too often. And that's, I guess, the main concern from government, is to ensure that it's in a fair arrangement with the private sector.
Goes to risk allocation, I guess, more broadly, and that the third P of PPP is partnership. So how are we working together?
That's always a theory. But in practice, I think government's got a lot more sophisticated over the course of the last generation in terms of its commercial capabilities within government. I think certainly when I joined the workforce, that probably wasn't the case, but that has happened over the last 25 years.
One of the questions coming through, which is a similar theme actually to Chris Money's session yesterday, where he spoke of the fact we've actually got a plethora of funding tools already available in the toolkit, but they're not necessarily being used. Again, an open one for the panel. Is that the same for financing? Have we got enough tools, we're just not using them? Or are there more tools or silver bullets that anyone would like to offer?
I'd probably say that the government has been trying to lean in this area, and I think it's now a great opportunity to try and take tools like IFF that we've heard about and give it the chance to develop and give the market the chance to test it further and innovate further with what we've been given. But like Hugh said, it's hard when they're only given a short life. It doesn't give the tools that much time if we're taking them out with the political cycles.
I agree with Ngahuia. I think one of the opportunity to take learnings from the IFF program as that develops is really key, and one of the interesting parts of that is the government support package component to it. Whether that can be rolled out on a broader basis to help sit behind social infrastructure financing would be something that would be pretty interesting to follow as we move through that program.
And Viewey Marks mentioned before the benefit, I guess, of putting these three social sectors together, that they derive benefits off each other if it's planned and organised together, perhaps when they're looking at procurement. And so one of the common themes and questions coming through from the audience is, are there opportunities for procuring agencies to seek co-funding from other agencies to achieve broader outcomes?
Yeah, one of the issues that I've dealt with before is the lack of coordination between social infrastructure procurers, where situations have arisen, certainly in my previous role, where we've just built a school, and community services have indicated that, in fact, if you built the school slightly differently, it might have met a whole range of needs that we now need to procure a separate building to do. So I think there is an opportunity, not always, but there's certainly an opportunity to, and this is the real challenge that we have from an infrastructure planning perspective, to ensure that we have communication and we actually connect up where we have opportunities for our social infrastructure to meet purposes which are beyond just the one procuring entity.
So more questions coming through. Thank you very much for the audience participation. Can we be honest about the current increased costs down the road for PPPs, both here and around the world? Future generations are going to be paying either way, surely.
I guess if you're comparing an increased cost to no spend on your asset, that might, that kind of gives you a different equation. So I think, sometimes we sort of compare the wrong things. We don't have the right benchmarks or the right context for what we spend on our existing assets using our ordinary government funding tools and then re-spending again 40 years later, as opposed to spending on social infrastructure through a PPP vehicle that at the end of 25, 30 years, you've got an asset in a reasonable condition handed back to you. So, we do have some unfortunate kind of assumptions around, what we're comparing and what things truly cost. And I don't know if we actually, coming back to the outcomes question, I don't know if we really know what we're getting for how much, for how long, and when we're going to have to spend that all over again.
Another one for the panel. What can we do in the funding financing space to address inequality that Māori and Pacifica and other disadvantaged groups face in social infrastructure? And then if you think to procurement, how are we considering lifting Māori and Pacifica businesses in the trades as we're procuring social infrastructure? Any volunteers?
I mean, the government procurement rules already make it clear that the government is intent on leveraging procurement for broader outcomes that include support for Māori and Pacifica businesses, for workforce development and so on. I think at the moment in some of these procurements that we are still paying a bit of lip service to that. And so, but that's an area where some in the construction sector are being quite innovative and coming with some really good proposals. The really important thing is for the agencies procuring that infrastructure to value those proposals. If someone's coming with something that's really innovative around workforce and Māori and Pacifica businesses, but that's going to mean you're going to have to spend a little bit more. You don't value that. Then, frankly, it's kind of a waste of time. So I think we really need to value that and actually build that into our procurement. And if we pay a bit more, then that's good. And that is about creating those outcomes, and that is about ultimately measuring that. So we need to get with the program on that one.
I guess that was already somewhat in the framework within the PPP model, that it wasn't just about the lowest price, it was about a broader social outcome. So it's expanding on that across all procurement.
Absolutely, yep.
Sorry, Peter.
No, I just want to be controversial for a second. Having been a Chief Procurement Officer, I just recognise that sometimes it's braver to fund the program than to try and achieve the objective through a procurement outcome. And the reason I say that is that people who are expert in to use my terminology, Indigenous issues, are actually not the same people who are expert in procurement. And often you're using a sledgehammer to try and drive through a social outcome that's very important, but you're not using the most skilled people to actually do it. So I've always held the view it's best to appropriate the program and yet get the people who are experts in it delivering it than trying to achieve that outcome through people who really don't know much about the subject matter, which is your typical procurement officer. So I know that's probably a controversial statement, but that's my view, that you're best off getting that done by the people who are experts in the subject matter.
Thank you. And a couple more coming through. So risk transfer and PPPs has seen contractors struggle to make a fair and reasonable return. Appetite for PPPs has dropped significantly as a result, not just from the public sector but the private side as well. D&C contracts and risk transfer is also problematic. Is there a plan to make social development construction more appealing?
I can start off on this one. I'm not sure about the plan, but I'll talk about the broader issue. I think PPPs are at the brutal end of fixed price, fixed scope contracts. The construction market's had well-documented struggles over the last few years, and the construction sector accord is pulling us in a completely different direction to the PPP risk allocation. Right now, you won't get many D&C contractors who are asking where can they sign. So I think that the trick really there is if that market is to be sort of reconstituted or to start again, the Crown is going to need to think about the risk transfer that it takes, because neither equity nor debt are going to take any of the increased risks. As soon as we move away from a sort of full fixed price, fixed scope contract, the Crown is going to need to decide on if it's worthwhile doing. It's going to have to be worthwhile to take the risk that we are moving away from the construction contractors.
I think one last final one from the floor, and I think this is pretty squarely at you, Peter. What is Infracom's role in upskilling procuring agencies for social infrastructure?
I expected one of these to come through. So what we do is, this is actually quite an easy question, so I don't mind it at all. What we do is we partner with procuring agencies. We have a framework that we just approved around high value, high risk, where we look at projects that are complex and where there's great propensity for things to go wrong. If you look at the projects we've formally engaged in to support, they've all got their various reasons. There's accommodation and messing and dining for the New Zealand Defence Force, Scott-based redevelopment for Antarctica, New Zealand, and the plant biosecurity project for the Ministry of Primary Industry. So they all fit squarely in the high value, high risk model. And that's where we, being a very small organisation, we really have to triage our investment and our time and focus on where we think we can best get an outcome. And I describe Infracom, this is a very Aussie analogy, I'll have to say, but we're like Vegemite well served, spread very, very thinly across a whole range of projects. And we have to focus on where we can get the best value. So that's really where we're adding value as an organisation, partnering with the organisation, partnering with delivery agencies that really have complex projects that we can come in and support, not replace the commercial advisor, but supplement what they do.
Fantastic, thank you. And thanks everyone for your engagement today. That was one of the better sessions I think I've seen where there's been plenty of questions coming through. And thanks again to the POWER panel. I will call you that again. If we had a silver bullet, Hugh, we wouldn't be here discussing it, and that doesn't just apply to infrastructure funding and financing for social infrastructure, but all of the issues we're discussing here at the conference. So please join me in thanking our panellists today.